Welcome to the final course of this year's Alumni College. We are very happy to have John Sheehy, who wrote the best book in the world, talking about some of the highlights, some of the 14 highlights of that book, namely the Presidents of Reed from Foster through Diver, I assume. I cannot top Colin's introduction of John yesterday afternoon. He really is the uber volunteer of all volunteers at Reed. And as the introduction to the book makes quite clear, John knows more about Reed than any person currently living. And so he is the perfect person to give this talk on the Presidents of Reed. John.
Thanks, Jim. Welcome, everyone. I want to apologize this morning. I lost my voice last night in all the revelry, so if you have a hard time hearing me, I'm doing my best. I thought I'd start out this morning where everything starts out at Reed, which is with Homer, who's the grandfather of oral history, okay? And I had a wonderful opportunity at Christmas at the alumni solstice party in Berkeley. I won the top door prize, which was a copy of the Iliad. Then I opened it up and I found out it was inscribed for new and coming freshmen. And I realized now, many of you probably know, they've switched this year to the Odyssey. So they were unloading these books. But I was a happy recipient of this. And about the same time, a new translation of the Iliad was released. And I happened upon a review of it in the New Yorker magazine. By Daniel Mendelsohn, who teaches classics at Bard. And it's a translation by Stephen Mitchell, and I've also bought that, and I've been reading both now, which has been really wonderful. And what really struck me in the review that Mendelsohn wrote is that he made the claim that the Iliad actually is very highly relevant to today's modern world, because the question it raises is essentially a very modern existential one, which is how do we fill our short lives with meaning? Now, as you may recall in reading the Iliad, and I assume almost everybody in here has, Homer frames that question around the plight of Achilles, a very temperamental man of action who chooses to accept a glorious but short life, dying on the battlefield, rather than taking the option of returning home and living a long but insignificant life, because he doesn't want to die a nobody. So I must confess that that point sort of eluded me 30-odd years ago when I read the Iliad as a freshman here at Reed. I was more interested then in Homer's storytelling, which perhaps explains why I became a literature major. But it was also a love of stories that initially drew me to the Reed Oral History Project. And a couple of years actually into the project then, I came to realize that oral history is less about history than it is about memory. And memory, of course, deals essentially with the same existential question that Mendelsohn points to in the Iliad, which is how do we fill our short lives with meaning? One of the ways that I noticed that Homer addresses meaning and memory in his book is through the use of lineage. Characters, as you recall, are always introduced in the Iliad by their lineage, memory of which gives their actions of valor or disgrace a meaningful context. There's the story of Glaucus in Book 6, some of you may recall, which I think is an especially poignant example of this. So in thinking about lineage at Reed, back in 1998, I set out with a small cadre of fellow alums to launch our own recovery expedition, not to Troy to bring back Helen, but to capture the stories of alumni, retired faculty, administrators, and trustees, and then bring them back to Reed as a gift for the college's centennial. We succeeded in interviewing over 1,400 people. 400 of those interviews were one-on-one interviews, and I know some of you either conducted those or were involved with those. And another 1,000 interviews were in group sessions, either at reunions weekends like this weekend, or through storytelling sessions led by Cricket Parmalee around the country. We also incorporated into our project a number of legacy interviews conducted by long-term history professor Dorothy Johansson, class of 33, who started interviewing people in 1935 for the college's 25th anniversary. And on a personal note, as a student here, as a work-study student, I was assigned to work with Dorothy Jo when she was an archivist here She had this little office off to the side of the chapel. And I didn't know it then. Had I had the foresight, I would have organized things a little bit better, because when I went back into her paperwork, there were a lot of questions I had for her, of course. But it was a wonderful personal kind of journey for me to come back to that work here. Now, oral history is a very tricky discipline. Many academic historians continue to view it with suspicion, and it is easy to see why. The human memory is wildly selective. No two people tend to have the same recollection of the same event. And when it comes to read oral history, that problem is only magnified. For me, it's sort of like watching Kurosawa's classic film, Rashomon, if anyone has seen that, in which a crime is witnessed by 4 individuals and described in the film from 4 mutually contradictory ways. That will give you a sense of the challenge I had in putting together the book Comrades of the Quest. Yet beneath the hypothetical narratives of what happened in the oral history runs the deeper purpose of memory, that of filling our short lives with meaning. The themes and structures that people's memories take on can offer ways of getting at the meaning they ascribe to what happened, even though the eyewitness accounts and details may be sketchy and the narratives unreliable. Alessandro Portelli, who's an Italian theorist in the field, attributes this meaning-making phenomenon to what he calls places of memory. If we can view memory as a flowing stream, then these places, these meaningful places of memory are small eddies where flotsam and jetsam gather and circle sometimes endlessly in our minds. Now, when looking at the oral history of an institution like Reed, it strikes me that some of the most convenient eddies to focus on are those of distinctive presidential eras. So with that, welcome to the study of lineage that I'm calling the Reed paradox in times of presidential transition. The Reed paradox was born 100 years ago when Reed's first president, William Foster, set out with his posse of hand-picked faculty and students on what he called Comrades of the Quest to pursue one primary goal, which was to make Reed College the holy grail of critical thinking. For Foster, that meant challenging the status quo in higher education, which at the time was split between the narrow pre-professional pursuits of research universities and that of traditional liberal arts colleges, many of whom had relaxed their academic requirements and aligned themselves with spectator sports, social climbers, and purchased degrees in an attempt to remain popular in an age of science and technology. It was a situation, as Woodrow Wilson famously observed, where the sideshows had swallowed the circus. In other words, not that much different than what we find in higher education today. Foster went about this task by rethinking everything about higher education to create a blueprint for what he called the ideal college. His intention was not to be different for the sake of being different, but rather for the sake of innovating the liberal arts, and in doing so, making them more relevant in preparing students for the ever-widening dimensions of the modern world. In that spirit, Reed's launch was greeted in the words of E.B. McNaughton, some of you may remember, an early Reed trustee and later president of the college in the late 40s and early 50s, as like a comet falling from the sky. From the very beginning, Reed quickly established a reputation as an innovator and a radical upstart. And while its educational model would go on to inspire other colleges, much to Foster's disappointment, it would not be replicated. It would instead become a distinctive college, an iconoclast, ultimately coming to embrace in its paradoxical manner one of the most conservative curriculums in America, and in doing so evolve its brand image from radical upstart to radical traditionalist in today's world of higher education. That was partly because in making critical thinking the holy grail at Reed, Foster had also imbued the college with what he called a deathless spirit of nonconformity to the status quo. In his own words, Foster said, "I hope that Reed would stand staunchly, and if necessary, stand alone for whatever Reed College considered right." Herein lies the essence, I believe, of the Reed paradox. As anyone who has seen the classic biker movie, The Wild One with Marlon Brando, knows, a large part of being a nonconformist relies on being misunderstood by the world around you. That sense is usually amplified by a need to feel as though you are sleeping in the camp of the enemy, stifled by surrounding forces. The phenomenon of the Reed paradox began in the college's first decade, as noted by one of the founding professors, E.O. Sisson. Sisson said, like every innovating scheme, Reed was ceaselessly subject to forces dragging away from its peculiarities and back to normalcy. There seemed to be no bounds to the public misunderstanding and representation of an institution that ventured to break the hard crust of custom and orthodoxy. Reed was misunderstood not only by provincial Portland, but also by a number of Reed's trustees over the college's first half-century, who, along with a number of the presidents they appointed, struggled to change Reed into more of a normal, by which they meant conforming, college. Now, while Reed has clearly evolved from its revolutionary roots over the past 100 years, the spirit of nonconformity that underlies its distinctiveness remains, as we saw with Reed's withdrawal from the rankings of the U.S. News and World Report in the late 90s. That distinctive position, I believe, was carved out by three primary factors, all of which were introduced within the college's first 15 years. They were by design, by necessity, and by paranoia. To talk about how these three factors evolved, I want to first introduce a model called the organizational life cycle. And although I was a lit major, it turned out when I got out of Reed, I had a kind of a secret wonky side, and so you're going to see that come out now. This is a model some of you who are MBAs and whatnot may be familiar with. It was developed by the Boston Consulting Group in the 1960s. The particular model I'm going to use comes from a group called the Adidas Institute, deals with organizational development. Its basic premise is that the life cycle of an organization or an institution essentially follows predictable stages of development that are similar to the human life cycle, and it looks something like this. The life cycle is distinguished by two basic trajectories: growth on the upswing, as distinguished by the continuous line, and then control on the downswing, which is distinguished here by the broken lines. Each of the stages within the life cycle have a different balance of growth and control. Growth dominates the early stages, and control dominates the aging side of the curve. The goal for an organization of this model is to first attain and then maintain a state of what is called prime. You'll notice that up at the top, just before you get to stability. Prime is a level of maturity in which growth usually maintains some edge over control. But the two exist in a state of tension one might call responsive instability, meaning that the organization is flexible enough to adapt to new challenges in the environment, but has enough controls in place to do so in a manner that protects and furthers its mission and its core values. Unlike the human life cycle, which is essentially a straight shot to the grave, the theory here is that it is possible for an organization to remain in an extended state of prime for some time by continually renewing and adapting itself to a changing environment. Reed reached prime within its first 15 years, and it did so by going through the stages of infancy, go-go, and adolescence, with each stage marked by a traumatic presidential transition. The infancy and go-go stages were represented by the era of William Foster, 1911-1920, the adolescent stage by Richard Schultz in the early 20s, and the prime itself was achieved during the so-called golden era at Reed, during which the college was more or less faculty-led. I'm now going to briefly touch upon the presidential transitions between each era in my exploration of the Reed paradox. During the infancy and go-go of the Foster era, the college's distinction was pursued by design. Foster came to Reed at age 31, fresh from receiving his doctorate at Columbia's Teachers College, with his blueprint of what he called the ideal college that he had written up as his dissertation. So imagine finishing your PhD and taking your dissertation and starting a college with it. It's a pretty gutsy move. Hard driving, argumentative, and evangelistic, Foster was a follower of the pragmatist movement that flourished at the turn of the century. and had studied at Columbia under John Dewey and at Harvard as an undergraduate, had been exposed to William James, both originators of the pragmatist philosophy. Now, pragmatism's essential premise was that a skepticism toward ideologies, a view that ideas were to be viewed not as immutable truth, but as contingent and adaptable responses to the environment, tools people could utilize in coping with the world around them. Or to quote William James' famous maxim, truth is what works. Employing a scientific methodology to social problems in a universe they viewed as still in play had a liberating effect on a generation of jurists, journalists, policymakers, and academics who comprised the progressive movement in the early 20th century. It was also the basis of Foster's quest to make critical thinking, or one might say thinking about thinking, the holy grail at Reed. Like a good progressive, the purpose of critical thinking for Foster was to train leaders in challenging the status quo through innovations that move society forward, especially in the area of social action and cultural change. That required, in Foster's words, the freedom and independence to proclaim the truth without fear or favor of politicians or religious sects or benefactors or public cries or its own administrative machinery. Foster may have been a starry-eyed crusader, but he was also a shrewd educational entrepreneur. Accordingly, independence became the context for community at Reed, with self-reliance and intellectual risk-taking as its desired outcomes. Only in such an environment could students be trained in pursuing breakthroughs and innovations in every field without being hampered by socially imposed and compromising boundaries. That was the very heart of Foster's ideal college, and it set the stage for much of what followed during the next 100 years, especially in the area of student life. E.O. Sisson described the essence of the ideal college as being built upon three pillars: intellectual freedom, academic rigor, and egalitarian democracy. Foster believed that each of the pillars was wholly dependent on the other two. Intellectual freedom represented a state of being, academic rigor, the path to attaining that state, and egalitarian democracy, the environment necessary to supporting and enhancing that attainment. Foster's design of the ideal college, however, embraced three paradoxes, all of which we continue to struggle with today. The first was that intellectual freedom requires discipline. This comes as no surprise, I'm sure, to Reedies in the room, but it is not a commonly held understanding of freedom, even in other parts of higher education. The Latin root of the word discipline is discere, meaning to learn. Freedom was realized by teaching students how to form a disciplined relationship with freedom itself. Foster's academic rigor was a process of completely grinding down a person's conditioned beliefs and ideologies and replacing them with a pragmatic method of thinking that ideally acknowledged no boundaries, where people were free to think anything and everything. It was by its very nature stressful and painful. There was no easy way through it. You could supplement the process with services and counseling, but you could never completely resolve the pain of going through it without eliminating the process itself. There were going to be casualties. The attrition rate out of the gate after the first two classes was over 60%, and it would remain between 50 and 60% for the next 80-odd years. It was going to leave scars and create an alumni with a love-hate relationship of the institution that was not necessarily found at other colleges. The second paradox was that shared governance promotes innovation. And Foster himself was an anti-traditionalist and an anti-authoritarian, except when it came to imposing his own vision. In other words, a true Reedy. Reed's Constitution, which provided unprecedented shared power to the faculty and autonomy to the student government, remember this is in 1911, was ideally meant to encourage both self-reliance and ongoing innovation within those bodies without the constraints of executive top-down administration. To Foster's surprise, however, the checks and balances inherent in such a democratic structure made advancing the overall college a slow and messy process, and soon led to a general conservative posture on the part of both faculty and students, soon supported by a growing alumni that came to be called Old Reed. The third paradox was that social freedom fosters community. Unlike the first paradox, where discipline led to attaining intellectual freedom, in the social realm, that paradox was reversed. Here, social freedom led to establishing community norms. This was because for Foster, self-reliance was the basis of independence. Students were not expected to unthinkingly conform to a set of social and moral expectations imposed upon them, but instead to form a common understanding of community norms through examination and debate. In Foster's mind, a community that valued its independence would naturally rely upon mutual self-restraint as a means of protecting that value in the community. To institutionalize his belief, Foster adopted the honor principle, an ambiguous ethos of integrity in place of traditional hard and fast rules. The non-codified nature of the honor principle required that it be annually re-examined and thereby remain relevant to the contemporary mores of the campus at any given time. The question, what is the honor principle, quickly became Reed's equivalent of the ancient Zen koan, what is the sound of one hand clapping? To define it in absolute terms was to violate it. Instead, the honor principle occupied a paradoxical middle ground between rules and no rules, ideally incorporating both, but not abiding in either, leaving the community free to debate and determine their own code of conduct. Foster's honor principle faced two primary threats. The first was apathy. To remain relevant, the honor principle required an intentional presence in the community. Fortunately, the tradition of the annual spring crisis, which I'm sure many of you experienced, became a valuable means of engaging in principled discussion of its existence or non-existence. However, for students, social freedom appeared most relevant when it was defined by the threat of repression. The issue of the man first reared its ugly head after a fire hose fight in 1916 seriously damaged the old dorm block and all the furniture in it. That development led to the second major threat to the honor principle for Foster, and that was ideology. By the rip-roaring 20s, a number of students had adopted a libertarian or laissez-faire ideology in defining the honor principle, especially in social behaviors involving sex and intoxicants. In terms of organizational development, by embedding paradoxes in his design of the ideal college, Foster ensured that there would always be a creative tension in the operation of the college that would keep alive his deathless spirit of ideals. But as the early college struggled with Foster's paradoxes, it became clear that with the good of each came some bad. But to try to lose the bad also risked losing the good. The only way forward was to work within the paradoxes, which gave the rise to the birth of irony at Reed as a tool of creativity in working with the tension without eliminating it. Now, after experiencing a heady period of go-go in the college's first 6 years, Foster, like many entrepreneurs who get a taste of early success, overextended his reach, going off in directions beyond the college's core educational mission and trying to reform not just higher education, but all of provincial Portland. By 1917, the college was hosting free extension courses to 55,000 local citizens on a range of academic and socially progressive topics. In the conservative quarters of Portland, however, Foster's progressive agenda was met with major backlash. His outspoken opposition to America's entry into the First World War in 1917, coupled with a regional recession that decimated Reed's endowment at the time, which was tied up in real estate, subsequently thrust the college into a major financial and PR crisis. The final straw was the war itself, which decreased enrollment of male students at a time when the college was highly dependent, as always, on tuition income, and put Reed into an early death spiral called the founder trap. It ended with Foster's resignation in 1919. At that point, the original trustees, aging and unable to mount the energy to revitalize the college, brought in a new board of regents made up of 6 local business and civic leaders to find a new visionary who could see in Reed's devastated state opportunities to launch a new stage of recovery. Which brings us to the transition to Reed's second president, Richard Schultz, in the beginning of Reed's adolescent stage. During adolescence, the vision and spirit of the founder needs to be institutionalized in the organization so that it can live on without the founder's presence. At this stage, growth still dominates the life cycle, but unlike the heady go-go times of Foster, certain controls are introduced to minimize the possibility of the organization being whipsawed around by the whims of any one person into death spirals like the founder's trap. Note, however, the jagged lines at this stage represent a very stormy period of adjustment. Richard Schultz was a highly energetic, personally engaging, charismatic professor of history at the University of Washington, whose defining life experience had been the 3 years he had spent at Oxford as one of the first Rhodes Scholars. Like all Reed presidents, he arrived without a clear understanding of the financial challenges he was facing or the fact that he would have to raise money. Like Foster, he came to Reed with an experimental dream plan, a manifesto he called New Humanism, intended to be a unified reinterpretation of the whole of existence. No dream too small for this man. New Humanism was Schultz's antidote to the disillusionment and disintegration left in the wake of the First World War. Schultz's main challenge was grafting his New Humanism onto Foster's rootstock of intellectual freedom, academic rigor, and egalitarian democracy. He did so by institutionalizing Foster's design with a prescribed curriculum grounded in the humanities. Schultz's plan was on the leading edge of the new general education programs that sprang up between the First and Second World Wars, and that were primarily geared to providing a sense of order in a world that was perceived as coming apart. Accordingly, the central theme that Schultz stressed was that unity is understanding, the need to see things whole. An early internationalist, Schultz viewed the training in critical thinking at Reed as crucial to making students better world citizens. To model that at Reed, he introduced the small conferences he had experienced at Oxford and worked to foster a stronger sense of community bonds. He was, in fact, the first to introduce the concept of the Reed community, to provide students with a model to work toward when they went forward into the outside world. Schultz's curricular plan, however, was as wildly visionary and impractical as Foster's blueprint of the ideal college. Board member E.B. McNaughton remarked, Schultz would come into the regents' meetings and start talking about his hopes for the college. No one could understand him because he talked so fast. After the meetings were over, everyone would say, "What in the hell was the man talking about?" Schultz's original curricular design was so centered around the humanities and social sciences that it was impossible for science majors to complete their departmental requirements. Accordingly, it was met with fierce opposition from the science faculty, almost all of whom were Foster holdovers. For the entire 3 years of Schultz's presidency, there was open civil war among the faculty, the scars of which lasted well into the 1950s. Then, in 1924, in the middle of negotiating an end to the faculty civil war, Schultz died in office. The common belief was that he had worked himself to death, that the presidency of Reed College was a man-killing job. In truth, he died of complications from a burst appendix. That threw the fledgling Reed into another crisis in the life cycle called the divorce. In the divorce, the visionary entrepreneur either dies or is expelled, leaving a power vacuum. At this critical juncture, the organization is usually vulnerable to premature aging, as those seeking to end the crisis attempt to impose controls that inadvertently curtail further growth to the state of prime. This is what it looks like from a systems point of view. The crisis creates a turning point that plunges the organization's growth trajectory suddenly downward, creating a gap in the growth pattern called the gap of transition, where the seeds of a new framework, a new way of envisioning the college, need to be planted. And for this to work, you need to plant, and the seeds are represented by these black dots, you need to plant a lot of seeds, because in the changing environment, you're never sure which ones will actually take root and grow into a new stage of development. If all the seeds fail to germinate, the organization continues its downward spiral to death. In this critical gap of transition, the Reed trustees decided in 1924 to bring back to campus as president one of Reed's founding faculty members, Norman Coleman. Coleman had left Reed in 1920 to direct a company labor union in Portland called the 4Ls. His orders from the trustees were to dismantle Schultz's plan and restore Foster's original free electives curriculum, thereby ending the faculty feud, and then to place Reed on a more conventional path that would put to end the college's godless radical image in Portland, thereby making it easier for the trustees to raise money. The trustees, however, underestimated the faculty, who faced with this common threat, united in opposition, consolidating Schultz's and Foster's innovations into a refined curricular design that proved to be the new framework for growing Reed out of the divorce trap, and thus was born a new stage called the Golden Era. The Golden Era extended from 1925 to 1945. During this period, a powerful group of senior faculty, using the power-sharing constitution that Foster had created somewhat naively in 1915, consistently outmaneuvered President Coleman and his normalizing initiatives. The Golden Era faculty further served to hone Reed's iconoclastic distinction by necessity and paranoia. They did so by employing two core values. The first, frugality, and the second, insularity. While the lack of financial resources made frugality necessary, it also forced the faculty to focus on doing one thing well, which was institutionalizing the college's core mission of critical thinking around the humanities-based curriculum. Frugality also supported Foster's principle of self-reliance. Tuitions paid the bills in the 20s and 30s, as there was no endowment, and faculty was fully engaged in running the administration of the college. There was no money to hire administrative officers. It was basically the president and the janitor. Paranoid of attacks by the local community, which had objected to Foster's reforms and Schultz's experimental curriculum in internationalism, and also paranoid of the hostile presidents hired by the board, the Golden Era faculty turned Reed inward for the sake of protecting their educational mission. They rejected the relevancy of Foster's social activism and of Schultz's internationalism, and evolved the college's mission to serving the life of the mind, critical thinking for the sake of critical thinking. During this golden era, Reed reached a period of prime, that level of maturity in which growth still maintains some edge over control, but the two exist in a state of tension, as I've called responsive instability, allowing the organization to adapt to new challenges in the environment, but to do so in a manner that protects and furthers its mission and core values. Between 1925 and 1940, the college was generating the highest percentage in the country of Rhodes Scholars, as well as students who went on to get doctorates in science, and the third highest percentage of doctorates in social sciences. As with all things Reed, these outcomes only reinforce the iconoclastic mystique of the Reed paradox in higher education. No one could figure out exactly how they pulled it off. Even at Reed, these outcomes were something of a mystery. which only reinforced the reluctance to tinker too much with the educational model for fear of throwing a monkey wrench in the works. But in systems thinking, an organization must also always be aware that its current model, no matter how well it is performing in a state of prime, resides in a fragility zone given to the ever-changing environment around it. The failure to continually adapt to that changing environment, which usually occurs due to the desire for greater stability, eventually leads the organization toward a turning point of crisis that begins the downward descent of the life cycle into a stage called aristocracy. Aristocracy is just what it sounds like. A certain constituency or group of constituencies exerts stifling control in the organization over other constituencies. Gone is the tension in the wire. This gradually became the situation with the faculty that ran the college during the Golden Era. By the early 30s, a frustrated President Coleman threw in the towel, returning to teaching English at Reed. He was succeeded by a man named Dexter Keyser. A New Deal economist, Keyser battled with the faculty oligarchy for 8 years to provide more balance to what he considered an over-intellectualized environment by emphasizing sports, social science, and the arts. Finally, after a vote of no confidence by the faculty and a call to Washington for war duty following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Keyser resigned. In the decades that followed, all of the major crises involving presidential transition at Reed, of which there were many, essentially were battles over pulling the college out of aristocracy and back to a state of prime. They represented a struggle between the conservative fear that Reed might lose its distinctiveness if it deviated from its educational model, and the progressive awareness that the college needed to continue adapting to the changing environment with an eye towards surviving in the future. This continual tug of war between the forces of control and growth I call the Battle of Old Reed. Now, to wrap up, I'd like to just briefly point to 3 presidential transitions where this battle plunged the college into death spirals. And based upon the audience here, I think many of you experienced these. They were the transition from McNaughton to Ballantyne-Sullivan, from Sullivan to Rosenblum to Bragdon, and from Bragdon to Powell to Koblich. In other words, every other presidency. In each case, the common wisdom is that the man in the middle, Ballantyne, Rosenblum, and Powell, was simply the wrong man for the job. Yet while the personal temperaments and skill slates of these 3 particular presidents may have been somewhat lacking in terms of successfully meeting the challenges they faced, in each of their presidencies, there were similar underlying issues that indicate the institution had drifted into aristocracy and was trying to get back to a state of prime. Without going into too many of the particulars of each transition at the risk of grossly oversimplifying, I'd like to briefly outline the general dynamics that occurred in each of these transitions using my life cycle model. The first was in the early 40s, late 50s. By that time, the golden era faculty was deep into a stage of aristocracy. Meanwhile, the external environment in higher ed was dramatically changing with the GI Bill, the government using college science facilities for R&D, and the rising demand for college graduates to meet the needs of the modern economy. Longtime trustee E.B. McNaughton, who had served as a part-time president for 4 years prior to Duncan Ballantyne's arrival, devoting himself to stabilizing the college by primarily raising money and leaving the faculty alone. That proved to be a mistake. Without that offsetting presidential tension in the system, the faculty fell into a state of aging controls. When Ballantyne arrived in 1952, he identified the areas that needed to be addressed to return Reed to prime: the need for student services, the stifling nature of the faculty constitution that prevented innovation, and the updating of the Reed curriculum. But Ballantyne led these initiatives with a controlling nature and subsequently lost the confidence of faculty and students. When the McCarthy witch hunt came to campus in 1954, it proved to be the tipping point that caused the college to completely collapse financially, with students withdrawing, leading to the resignation of Ballantyne and a number of the trustees who had backed him. Richard Sullivan arrived at Reed in 1956 and turned the college around, pulling it back to prime. Sullivan correctly anticipated the competitive environment in higher ed with the coming baby boom and led Reed on the first true growth spurt it had had since the days of Richard Schultz, upgrading the facilities, expanding the faculty and student body, increasing salaries, and raising academic standards. Sullivan set the foundations of the modern college as we know it here today. But he did so by betting on the come, investing one-time grants and expanding staff and infrastructure that the college couldn't sustain financially going forward. When he resigned in 1966, the college was running on an annual deficit over $1 million, projected into the future, with an endowment of only $4 million in the bank. Law professor Victor Rosenblum stepped into the presidency in 1968 with pledges from the trustees to mount a major fundraising campaign and a personal goal to enhance Reed's curriculum. Neither initiative ever materialized. The college was too focused by the internal battle of Old Reed. The faculty aristocracy at the time, known as the Old Guard, was locked in an ideological conflict with a cohort of younger faculty known as the Young Turks. The Young Turks sought to jettison Reed's prescribed humanities curriculum and make the college more relevant to the times. That included implementing a Black Studies program that operated outside the oversight of the faculty oligarchy. Rosenblum's approach to the Battle of Old Reed was to try and please everyone. He ended up pleasing no one, and after only 2 years, returned to teaching law, leaving the college on the verge of bankruptcy, with students once again fleeing in droves. Paul Bragdon stepped into this breach in 1971, and over a 17-year period, successfully led the college back to prime, like Sullivan, striking that key balance between growth and stability, but in a more sustainable manner. And yet Bragdon, too, in the second half of his term, ran into heavy resistance from the faculty and student aristocracy in his efforts to renew and reunify the curriculum and to improve the conditions of student life. When he left Reed in 1988, the college was on its strongest financial footing to date, but the aristocracy of the time was resisting a number of cultural changes coming down in the larger social and academic environment. The college was stable, but not for long. Those cultural issues bubbled up and exploded during the administration of Bragdon's successor, Jim Powell. Much like Duncan Ballantyne in the 1950s, Powell identified the areas that needed to be addressed to return Reed to a state of prime: improving student life, innovating college governance, updating and reviewing the curriculum. These, by the way, are just perennial concerns at Reed. But also, like Ballantyne, Powell attempted to lead by control and not necessarily growth. The Battle of Old Reed that ensued under his administration, this time between a new Old Guard and a younger, largely female faculty cohort, was sparked in part over conditions arising from the lack of a sexual harassment policy at Reed, and it tore the college apart. The imposition of federal drug and alcohol policies on the college also fed into the cultural changes between students and the administration in this new battle. Upon Powell's resignation in 1991, Reed once again fell into a financial crisis, with students fleeing in droves. Steve Koblich, who succeeded Powell in 1992, repaired the financial situation, raising a boatload of money, pulled the community back together, and led Reed on a 9-year growth spurt back to prime. In each of these three presidential transitions, the men in the middle, Ballantyne, Rosenblum, and Powell, took the college right down into what is called the gap of transition. Descending into that gap is sometimes called going into the valley of death. And I can tell you from reading dozens of oral histories describing these three particular presidential transitions that the descent looks something like this. It resembles entering Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's grieving cycle, full of denial, anger, resistance, more anger, fear, confusion, and stress. ending in a ball of confusion and chaos that breaks the hearts of all involved. As we've seen, these battles for Old Reed also create financial crises as they drive away tuition-paying students, placing Reed, with its relatively small endowment, in a very vulnerable position. The three presidents that came to Reed while it was wandering in the valley of death, Dick Sullivan, Paul Bragdon, and Steve Koblich, all had to first initially stabilize the college's financial condition before they could lead the college back to prime. They did so by leading with creative growth, incorporating new controls and the dynamic momentum as they moved forward, unlike their failed predecessors, who had all led the college initiatives with either control or, in the case of Victor Rosenblum, a lack of control. They each encountered initial skepticism before gaining acceptance for their plans, and then instilled hope and enthusiasm for their leadership to raise a renewed Reed to even greater heights than it had reached as Old Reed. But you don't have to go down into the valley of death to remain in a state of prime, unless, of course, you're looking for some type of religious conversion. As I said before, in systems thinking, prime is looked upon as a period of responsive instability, a state in which there is always dynamic tension in the wire. Smart organizations in prime are always aware that its current model, no matter how well it is performing, is in a fragility zone in an ever-changing external environment. To stay in prime and not begin the descent into the valley of death, it's necessary to plant the seeds of a new framework when you're at the top of your game, and the first warning signs of fatigue are starting to set in. A time when you can still move forward with the strength and convictions of your values and mission instead of reacting defensively to stay up with the competition. A time like now. And we actually have a track record of that having occurred here at Reed College, amazingly so. And that was the presidential transition from Steve Koblich to Colin Diver. It was the first and only successful presidential transition in our entire history. That's one success out of 13. And has put Reed College, without question, on its strongest position of prime since first opening its doors in 1911. And I think that Colin Diver deserves our everlasting gratitude for having pulled off that historical feat. In the upcoming presidential transition that we're about to enter now with John Kroger, beginning July 1st, from an organizational development aspect, the main question on the table is how to remain in the state of prime. Or, to put it another way, how to protect Reed's educational model while remaining competitive for students and faculty in an ever-changing environment. In a sense, we are confronting as a community the same existential question that Daniel Mendelsohn ascribes to Homer's Iliad. How do we make Reed College meaningful in our short lifetimes? How do we carry forward the values and lineage that precede us? For what it's worth, my takeaway from the oral histories of those who have faced these tasks before us is that we need to, first, lead with growth, not control. To achieve prime, we have to model prime. And by growth, I don't mean erecting more buildings on campus. I mean facilitating a state of creative tension here in the institution among all constituencies, including the alumni. One that harnesses the historical strength of Reed's educational model while keeping it innovative and responsive to maintaining a vital future. Second, we need to continue to focus on doing one thing well, which arguably is providing the best model for a liberal arts education available. And that means maintaining Reed's distinctiveness by sticking to its core competency of critical thinking for the sake of critical thinking, instead of pursuing the rest of the herd with utilitarianism and instrumentalism and becoming an also-ran. And finally, we need to learn to love the paradox. And I don't mean the Paradox Cafe in the SU. Thank you very much.